Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google, and more. It's also available at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Susan Colton. Susan taught schools and public school classrooms and worked in school administration as a highly respected, nationally recognized principal. She's got a new book out, Principal's Passion, A Quest for Quality Public Education. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk with you and your listeners.
It's great to have you here. Now, the reason I contacted you is because you basically are saying that privatization of schools is a threat to democracy. Tell us about that.
Yes, I truly believe that that is what is currently happening in our society. Right now, we have a Secretary of Education who is pushing for the privatization of schools. Monies in our federal government and our state governments are being hoarded toward big business and toward the development of more, the development of more, more things from top down to, I'm not doing well, thank you. Can we start over? No. I'm going to edit
Yeah,
this.
sure. Just start it over. I'll just cut this out.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to start it over again at this point. So the reason I invited you on the show was because you have said that privatization of schools is a threat to democracy. How is privatization of schools a threat to democracy?
Well, Rob, originally when public schools were established back in the day of Thomas Jefferson and our forefathers, public schools were a way to educate the masses. And at that time, it was believed that an educated electorate would be the only way that a democratic society would survive. So from there, we went to President Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt said that public schools were a cornerstone for our democracy. So down through the years, it has been believed that public schools were a way to educate everyone, unlike other countries. People came to America for the American dream, and part of that American dream was to be educated and to be able to make choices and decisions as an individual person.
So how have things changed? You're saying that public schools are important to democracy. What makes private schools a threat?
Well, it's not so much the private schools, Rob. It's what's happening.
That's right. You said privatization.
Yes, privatization, because, parents do have choices. Parents certainly can spend and save their money and send their children to private schools, but 90% of our country depends on public school education. And so right now, what we have in our country are elite billion-dollar companies and people at the top of our government who are pushing for privatization of public education.
Why?
Let me give you an example. Our Secretary of Education.
That's Betsy DeVos, right?
That's Betsy DeVos, yes. Recently saw her on a show, on a 60-minute show, as a matter of fact, and she's being interviewed and she's being asked, if the charter schools and the for-profit charter schools in her state are doing so well, why aren't the public schools doing well? And the interviewer asked her, well, what happens when you go into a public school? And she said, I try not to do that. So the point of view here is that we are back to looking at elitism and only educating the rich, only educating people who can afford to go to private schools, or to take the lower class or the poverty-stricken people or children in our country and think that we're doing them a favor by providing them with a for-profit charter school that's going to make their education better than what they have in the public school system.
And it's not?
Oh, it's not. It's not. Right now, there are a lot of things happening in public schools and in communities that we don't hear about in the media. You know, we hear about all the negative things, and that's because back with No Child Left Behind and all of the top-down government waves of thinking, we have students who are learning by taking a test. We have teachers who are teaching to a test. We have no critical and no creative thinking going on in our schools. And so,
well, how do they argue for that? What's the argument for letting go of critical and creative thinking? I mean, I think it's horrible, but do they have some kind of a rationale for that?
well, I believe the rationale behind that was that all children would succeed to a particular level. So we would raise the standards in our country for all children to achieve at the highest possible world quality, world class education. However, what that did is it put learning for all students on the same level. For example, every child would be learning the same way on the same day. And we know that naturally and humanly that is not what happens with raising children and educating children. That they do not learn the same way on the same day, that we must nurture them, we must bring them along, we must work with them, give them an opportunity to think and to reason and to use their minds well, and to also.
So it makes me think of monoculture farming.
Yes.
Big farming combines, they'll take a crop and they'll grow tens of thousands of acres. And some countries just grow one crop. And there are huge problems with that in terms of sustainability. To do that, you have to keep adding chemicals, and you get decreasing yields. And it sounds like and it's a very top-down approach. It sounds like what you're describing, Leave No Child Behind, is a similar idea. It's centralized, and it has no individuality to it. It's a simple algorithm that doesn't work. In economics, that kind of centralized algorithm led to the collapse of the economy in 2008. And it sounds like what you're describing is something similar. My favorite educator is Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Are you familiar with his work?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and what he said was there are two kinds of education. There's banker education, which is you deposit information into a person's head and then regurgitate it. And there's dialogic education, where you engage in dialogue and you get people to think. And it sounds like you're describing is the second, the latter. And what the problem is that No Child Left Behind aims at depositing information that leaves you with an empty person who really has never learned how to think. Am I getting it?
Yes, absolutely. And since you brought up that metaphor as an example, one of the ones that I've used in the past, I worked with an educational thought leader, Dr. Philip Schlechte, and one of his thoughts, and he talks about public schools in the first way that you described, is a factory model, that students were the products, and the students were being, just put through all of the paces, kind of like the old Lucille Ball in the chocolate factory.
The assembly line.
All those kids were on the assembly line, and they were the products coming off.
And,
So,
and it reminds me, I did an interview with John Taylor Gatto at one point, who was who was given all kinds of awards in New York State. And what he and others have described is that the modern educational system was really based on the Austrian model over 100 years ago that was aimed to produce good factory workers and obedient soldiers. And it takes a different kinds of education to make somebody who is really able to fully engage in democracy and to think about the issues of a citizen and the responsibilities of a citizen.
And that's correct. And that's what public education was originally designed for in our forefathers' thinking, were to, not only educate the masses, but to give them education in the areas of becoming a good citizen.
Can you talk a little bit more about our colonial or early American history of education? Do you know much about that?
Well, I know that first of all, we Thomas Jefferson was very much in favor of educating the masses. He believed that the only way that we would survive in a new democratic society would be to have an educated electorate. And so, from there on, we moved through our other leaders, and I'm going to stumble through this one. We looked at having an important group of people in our country to be able to think and to make choices. For example, if we're going to elect someone who is going to take care of the people and not think about themselves or big business, then we are going to need to train people, and we're going to need to educate people to be able to think and make good decisions. And in order to do that, they have to have the opportunity to think and make good decisions. One of the things that we're talking about with the No Child Left Behind and the way that our testing atmosphere currently is in schools, students no longer are given the opportunity to think. We have, the opportunity for students to debate. We have Socratic seminars. We have a lot of things that can happen and used to happen in public schools and still do in schools that push for quality and that do not just go by mandated governmental standards of taking tests.
Do you think that there were underlying goals besides raising quality? Do you think that it was thought through when they came up with this No Child Left Behind that it would decrease participation in civics and in government and in politics? I mean, it almost sounds like that's what you're saying, that when they did this, they intentionally set up an educational system that would weaken democracy by weakening people's ability to intelligently participate in it.
And that's exactly what I mean, Rob. I do believe that it was thought through. There were a lot of billion-dollar corporations, nonprofits as well. The Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, that poured money into creating this Common Core, one-size-fits-all educational model. And from there, taking big billion-dollar businesses. Pearson Education, which is out of the UK, is the richest company that's made their money most recently in the last decade from creating tests to be able to assess students on this Common Core or this one-size-fits-all
So
education.
who benefits? So what you're making me think is that question, cui bono, who benefits?
Who benefits?
So Pearson Education is making a fortune testing these kids. Who else are the beneficiaries of Common Core, No Child Left Behind, and privatization?
Well, when I retired about 3 years ago, I was to the point where it was very difficult for me morally to assess teachers and students the way I was being asked to do so. My belief in working with schools is having teachers and students work together cooperatively to engage students based on their interests, to build education from the student outward. In other words, forget the usual organizational chart.
That sounds very bottom up to me.
Yes, it does. And let's move kids. If you look at a school system's organizational chart, for example, you start with the big system. You have the federal government, you have the state government, you have the local school board and superintendent, and then we trickle down, and finally, very, very, very far down at the bottom is the student. And my idea when I opened my entrepreneurial school was to flip that pyramid and put students at the top of the organizational chart, because that's the way education is meant to be. So who is benefiting by this?
Okay, so we're going to continue. I need to do a station ID, and then we'll be right back. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. I'm going to pause a little for silence because I'm going to plug in a bumper right here, so just so I can do it when I'm editing. That ought to do it. And my guest for this show is Susan Colton, a former retired principal who has written a book, Principal's Passion, A Quest for Quality Publication, who I'm having on because she is talking about the threat to education that privatization of schools, and I think also Common Core and No Child Left Behind offer us, the threat to democracy. So you were going to say who benefits from doing this to students?
Yes, the billionaires, the rich, the elite, those that already have, not the have-nots. And so what's happening right now is monies are being poured into those businesses to create the tests that assess our students on the Common Core and the No Child Left Behind movement. We also have teacher evaluation companies now. We have Robert Marzano, who is out there, and when I was working with teachers, he had a system of quality education, much like what our Thomas Jefferson thought about having a teacher academy, and really training teachers to teach students to think and do the right things.
Now, when you were trained as a teacher, as a principal, that was before No Child Left Behind and Common Core. Now, I think, what is it, about 10, 12 years that this program has been in effect. It was put into effect George W. Bush, if I recall, right?
That's correct. So we're on our second decade.
So are Teachers' Day being taught and educated in universities to approach education differently than they did when you and the teachers who before No Child Left Behind went into place, are they taught differently? Is it affecting the pedagogy?
Well, I think that universities still look at a broader perspective, but what happens is when teachers begin to get into their practice, their practicum, when they go to a school setting, they find that the things that they are taught, that all of the hopes and dreams that they had about being able to make connections and reach children through their teaching and learning are not happening, because within the school system, they are being asked to put those critical and creative thinking aside and to teach to a specific test.
Now, I'm not in education, so I'm not clear. Is No Child Left Behind and Common Core, are they this thing, or are they?
Well, No Child Left Behind was the first through George W. Bush. Actually, Common Core came along probably coming into the Obama presidency, and several of the large nonprofits jumped on board to say, well, let's do a federal, a national curriculum so that all students would learn at the same high standards. So we're not taking in the thing that really upsets me and frightens me about this is we have students and we have children who have special needs. Those children are able to exceed and be productive members of our democracy and our society, but they are not given the opportunity, and they are going to be, I fear, closed out of public education because they're not able to meet those standards. Now, they do meet the standards maybe eventually, but they don't meet them on the same day and on the same way as every child. And I think that that's totally inappropriate way to think of how we educate our children in our country.
Boy. So how is Common Core different from No Child Left Behind?
Well, No Child Left Behind really was an idea of how we would educate our students. Common Core became a national curriculum. So it really was a more refined way of taking No Child Left Behind and put it into a national curriculum.
And what is the price in terms of the quality of education, in your judgment, that we pay by using Common Core instead of the approaches to education that you believe in?
Well, I think the price is that we're going to have, if we are not careful, a whole generation or generations of students who graduate and they're not ready for the workplace as business leaders feel they should be, because they are not working together cooperatively in schools. My idea is to have students working together in teams, cooperative learning, giving students an opportunity to hear their voices and to examine their thought processes, and to actually have debates within the classroom, even with their teachers. There should be agreement and disagreement and discussion about how we learn and what we're learning, and differences of opinion. We have a very diverse society, and we need to allow that diversity to come to the table. And right now in public education, that is not happening. And my fear is that we're going to have cookie cutter robots that are going to be programmed for a different type of society than what are the common people who believe in education for the common good.
So you've been through this. You lived through the old way and the new way. How did you have to change your policies as a principal as the educational system shifted from the way that you prefer to this new Common Core, No Child Left Behind model? What did you have to tell the teachers who work for you?
Well, I had to tell them that these were the standards that we were to be teaching, and this was the test that we were going to give the students. However, I did not believe that teachers should put away all of their expertise, all of their educational training and pedagogy training on what is best for students and learning. And so we gave our teachers flexibility to be able to think creatively and critically and provide students with the standards they were supposed to know, but maybe not perhaps in the exact same way. So in other words, I tried to fly under the radar with my schools and my teachers, because what we were all about is we were all about people and relationships. We were all about nurturing our children and bringing them along from where they are to the potential that they had. And if that was, go ahead.
So that's very interesting. You were all about people and relationships and nurturing. Where does that fit into Common Core and No Child Left Behind?
It doesn't fit in there at all, Rob. And that's another travesty, because right now we have very little social and emotional learning taking place in schools. We believe in academic high standards for students. However, there is a concept of the total child. That the child is not just a brain academically, but they need to be educated socially and emotionally as well. You know, a perfect example of this is one of my school was one of the schools that were a feeder school to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the last school massacre took place. And right now, the debate in my area is about mental health education. And why are we not identifying these students? And yes, if we are identifying these students and we know who they are, then why are we not providing them with the social and emotional support that they need from their parents, their teachers, their school, and their community to be able to be productive and very, productive citizens?
Okay, so what you're saying is that this model, Common Core and No Child Left Behind, is hamstringing teachers' ability to support students emotionally?
Yes, it is.
And that indirectly could be contributing to school shootings?
Well, it can be contributing to students who are troubled in our system, that are not getting the supports that they may have been getting in the past before Common Core, when we were spending more time on individual student needs and working with those students. And that's where the special needs students come into play. I worked right alongside parents with students with autism, and one of their biggest concerns is that their children did not communicate the same way as other children.
Of course.
And if we were teaching them the same way and we weren't taking into consideration their child's needs, then what was going to happen to their child in this new system of education?
So we have about 2 minutes left to wrap up. Anything you want to finish with?
I believe that, that the humanity in us and the people and building relationships in communities is there, Rob. And I believe that what we see coming out of the latest school shooting is students standing up and voicing their opinions and saying enough is enough. We need to have our voices heard. And the parents also now are following. And I believe that we have hope for our future of education, that we can rally our communities together around our schools and build that community and those relationships, because it should be the individual communities, the parents, the business partners, and the students and teachers who are making the best decisions for their children and their neighborhoods.
Great, thank you. And this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. You've been listening to Susan Colton, who is a former principal, and she's the author of Principal's Passion, A Quest for Quality Public Education. Her website is SusanAColton.com. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thanks so much, Rob. It was a pleasure.